Hello, my name is Michael Witch, and I welcome you back to the new season of The Local Live. And with me is Maura Carlin.
Hi, Mike.
And tonight we have a very interesting topic and an interesting guest as well. And our topic is the Pope, Pope Francis. And what do we make of this man, this smiling Pope, who has made the cover of Fortune magazine and as well as made the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, and has been seen by some people as controversial, although he's wildly popular.
That he is.
And he does tweet and he emails, and I know that's what you follow.
That's
as well.
right. That's right.
And before we get going, we went out to the streets in Mamaroneck and Larchmont and asked some of you what you thought about Pope Francis. Take a look.
This week's Local Live Roundtable discussion is about Pope Francis. Let's see what people have to say.
Number one, I don't think that he should be on a Rolling Stones cover because that's too much exposure for someone who has that much power. He shouldn't be on that level right there.
I think he's doing a great job. I think he's just what the doctor ordered. He's really taken a step towards bringing in the young people, and hope it continues. You know, he's done a lot to, like I say, bring the world together.
Yes, I'm sure there are other people who also would have fit that spot, but I'm not necessarily against it in any way. I don't know. I just don't know if he was the absolute best choice.
Catholic or not, Pope Francis is a man that cannot be ignored. For The Local Live, I'm Matthew Velasquez, signing out.
And as always, we want you to join the conversation. You can call in with the numbers that you'll see on the screen. You can tweet, or you can email us to ask your questions or pose comments. Mike?
Thank you. And our guest tonight is the chair of the Religious Studies Department at Iona College. And welcome, Dr. Elena Procario-Foley.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You're also the Driscoll Professor of Jewish Catholic Studies at the college. And full disclosure, I'm also an adjunct professor at the college as well in the Mass Communications Department. But thank you for giving up your time tonight to help us understand something more about Pope Francis. Let's start with that. What do you make of this smiling Pope, this man? Every time I've seen a picture of him, he is smiling.
It's one of the great attributes. He smiles, he connects with people. I think they say it takes fewer muscles to smile than to frown, so we should just smile. And that connects him immediately to people. You know, we have our humanity through our faces, and the smiles connect people. And that is what he consistently says, is that we have to connect. We have to make these connections. So I think that with his smile, he begins that.
And yet he's seen by some as controversial. Where does he run into some problems?
I find that really interesting, and of course I know that people say this. I think they're surprised by his spontaneity, his off-the-cuff comments, things that aren't scripted. And so some of the controversy is really simple. It's the people in the Vatican perhaps who are responsible for protocols being a little stunned. Wait, he's going off script. This is not the tradition. This is not how we walk here or do this or do that. I mean, he lives at, Casa Santa Marta. I think I pronounced that correctly. It's not where the Pope usually lives. So that's a little bit disconcerting. People are unaccustomed to the new.
And he's also not wearing the red shoes.
Right, but not every Pope did that.
And he drives his own car.
And it's a Ford.
Car.
Yes.
Hand-me-down, I think, that he got from a priest in northern Italy. Although I thought he had sold that recently, but yeah.
But one of the objections we heard from the person on the street was an objection to him being on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, that he shouldn't be, be a rock star. Now, of course, he had nothing to do with being on the cover of Rolling Stone, but it's that kind of image that I think this person was opposed to.
And I don't understand that, because people widely called John Paul II a rock star. I mean, he had this outsized personality. He himself was an actor. And so I think the contrast then is Pope Benedict XVI with a very different, retiring, professorial seriousness, just came between two very charismatic popes. And Benedict wanted was concerned with the prayer life of the church, one of the many things he was concerned with, but with a certain propriety and a certain liturgical dignity. And so I think those comments might come from people who are concerned about that type of perception that they have of the church, or that they think the church should have, so that this pope is being off the cuff and talking to people and
more informal.
And, exactly.
On the other hand, isn't he also bringing people back into the church who weren't going before, Mike?
I think so. I mean, he's certainly appealing to me, and I'm somebody who has been wandering for a bit, and I've heard expressed on television people who've said, and on radio in recent programs, that people have called in and said, yeah, he's very inspiring, and he's somebody who's going to bring me back into the pew.
Yeah, I saw one interview, or read one interview where someone said, well, I'm not coming back yet, but I'm listening. But I'm listening.
Okay.
And so there's a wide range of reactions, as there is.
Just before Christmas, when he assembled the cardinals and the archbishops, he was pretty pointed. I mean, here's the headline in the story from, I think it's USA Today. It says, "Merry Christmas, you power-hungry hypocrites at the Vatican." That's pretty, I mean, just before Christmas.
Well, he did. Well,
why don't we start with what that's about?
Okay, right. Generally, the Pope gives a talk right before Christmas to the people, and priests and bishops at the Vatican. If I remember correctly, Pope Benedict's first such address was an interpretation of the Second Vatican Council, very theological, very important. It was talked about throughout his papacy, and in fact, in some of his interviews, Francis refers back to some of the language that Pope Benedict used in that, language of continuity and discontinuity and rupture, and other ways to use that message would be, homiletic, consolation, inspiration, preaching the gospel. And this was a list of 15, I believe, sins to avoid. 15
yes, ills.
15 traps to avoid. And among them are things that he has repeatedly said. Careerism, clericalism, insularity. He doesn't want the people who should be the pastors to look inward. He doesn't want them being defensive and protective. He wants to break open the doors. One of his great quotes has to do with, he said, sometimes I feel that Jesus Christ himself is knocking on the doors trying to get out, meaning trying to get out of the church, meaning bringing the church into the world. Another one of his wonderful images, very biblical images, is that of the sheep and the shepherd. And he says, the pastor should have the smell of the sheep on him. So let the church out. Let the church out into the world. And so this was a very consistent message that he's giving to his people, his fellow bishops.
But does it also have to do with him sort of cleaning house there? And one of the things I read suggested he was living away and keeping his own schedule so that no one really knew completely what was going on to keep them off guard.
I don't know. I obviously do not know the mind of the Pope. I don't have any inside line.
Wait a minute, I thought you were directly connected. Just kidding.
No. But he just had an interview, just came out in the Jesuit publication America. It's the current issue of America. It's a great interview. I think it's the first full-length interview that he has given in a Spanish-speaking publication. And he was asked by that journalist questions that had something of that hint of conspiratorial theory that you're suggesting. Did you fire, the head of the Swiss Guard? No, I didn't. I came in, his term was up, I was told I can't make a decision because I don't know the person. And he had discussions with the person, they had dinner, the person's time was, and he said, we came to an agreement, your time was up, I want to make, it's time for renewal, let's make some changes. So I think it's more about changes little by little. He's not living there because much more important than any sort of strategy. He says he doesn't like the word strategy. I don't want to talk about strategies. That's not what we're about. You know, any strategy to keep the curia, the term for the Vatican bureaucracy, not a strategy to keep them off guard. He's living where he's living because he needs to be with people. That's what he said. I need to be with people. I need to hear the people. And that's what he's asking everyone in the church, everyone is the church, to listen. You know, he said you have to have courage to speak and humility to listen.
Is his approach to a large degree dictated by his experience as a Jesuit? I mean, is he the first Jesuit who became Pope?
Yes.
He's the first Pope from the Southern Hemisphere, isn't he?
Yes.
Yes.
And the first, it's Francis I.
Yeah.
And so his choice of title is extremely important. I think most of the world who knows anything about saints assumed it was St. Francis of Assisi, and it was only those academic types among us who said, which Francis? Because there is a Jesuit Francis particularly as well. And so...
so can you talk a little bit about his Jesuit experience and how we might see that in how he goes about his day-to-day or his general approach?
Well, St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, has this process of discernment called the spiritual exercises. And I am absolutely no expert in the spiritual exercises. But it is a process of discernment that reflects on the course of Jesus' life, to just kind of summarize it very, very, very broadly. And in August of 2013, so he had been Pope for a few months, he gave a major interview that was published simultaneously around the world in all the various Jesuit, or in many of the various Jesuit publications. And he was asked, and that interview talks about the Jesuit experience, and he talks about that process of discernment. And the point of all of that is he's going to take time to make his decisions. He's going to allow himself to be corrected by that process of discernment. He said that early in his career as a leader in the Jesuits, he made some really bad decisions. He had too much of an authoritarian style, and that he's learned and he has moderated. And what he has come to is, as I said a moment ago, you need to listen, you need to adapt, although I'm not sure that I've seen him use that word exactly, and that you need to be in dialogue.
Let me just shift a little to the, if I say it correctly, the apostolic exhortation. It's about a year old. And it almost came, I mean, many who've read it have called it almost Marxist in its discussion of income inequality and redistribution of wealth. Is that really where he's heading?
This is not new. This is not new. We have a long tradition, something called an encyclical tradition, although we chose to write an apostolic exhortation, not an encyclical, and that's just a technical difference in document levels within the church. Dating back to Pope Leo XIII, it's called the Catholic Social Teaching, and Pope Benedict was called a Marxist. John Paul was never called a Marxist because he was so involved with fighting communism. But in terms of economic theory, when he says in that exhortation, you know, no to, I don't know, he doesn't say no to wealth, but he says no to maybe the culture of money, you know, no to an economy that oppresses. This is consistent Catholic teaching. You can look in the Bible, in the New Testament, in the Acts of the Apostles, and it talks about the first Christian communities sharing everything together. You can look in the letters of Paul in the New Testament, which talks about you must take care of the widows and the orphans and the less well-off before you come to celebrate at the table of the Lord. So before your worship is worth anything, you have to take care of the poor among you. Before you eat spiritual food, you have to give everybody real food. And so call the Christian tradition Marxist, if you will, if it means taking care of the oppressed and the least among us.
Okay. We actually have a bunch of emails, believe it or not.
Okay.
The first one is about same-sex marriage, whether you think that Pope Francis will ultimately recognize same-sex marriage in the Catholic Church, and would that be a good thing?
Okay, so one of the big hot topics in what we know as the culture wars. And one of the first things that kind of surprised people was when Pope Benedict said, we can't get stuck on these three issues.
Benedict or Francis?
I'm sorry, did I say Benedict?
said Benedict.
I'm sorry, Pope
Okay.
Francis. Good. These popes have been moving around in the past decade. Sorry about that. Pope Francis said we can't only be focused on these culture war issues. Then he, on his way back from the World Youth Day, he gave this off-the-cuff interview in the plane, and someone asked him about, you know, what do you think about homosexuality? And he said, well, you know, who am I to judge? And people made a lot of that. Let me quote something he said.
Okay.
So Pope Francis said, on the return flight from Rio de Janeiro, I said that if a homosexual person is of goodwill and is in search of God, I am no one to judge. In the press, it was, who am I to judge? By saying this, I said what the Catechism says. So he's placing himself on very strong ground there. Religion has the right to express its opinion in the service of people, but, and this is a consistent message, God in creation has set us free. It is not possible to interfere spiritually in the life of a person. And at another time, and then he says, a person once asked me in a provocative manner if I approved of homosexuality. I replied with another question, quote, tell me, when God looks at a gay person, does he endorse the existence of this person with love or reject and condemn this person? We must always consider the person. Here we enter into the mystery of the human being. In life, God accompanies persons, and we must accompany them starting from their situation. It is necessary to accompany them with mercy. When that happens, the Holy Spirit inspires the priest to say the right thing. It's Francis. He's within the tradition. He's within a theological tradition and a gospel tradition.
Are you suggesting that other predecessors were not because they came out so vehemently against?
I'm not suggesting that. There are documents that say some of this, and they don't get the same play. And
I think that's important when you say get the same play, because these days when you have tweets and emails and internet and reporters tagging along, they deliver one message. He may have one message and they shorten it. I mean, it becomes a headline, just like I read a few minutes ago.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, let me go to another question about Cuba. Jeff wants to know, is it right for the Pope to meddle in foreign affairs? And goes further to say, isn't Cuba a godless nation? I'm not sure where he's going with that, but...
Popes, quote-unquote, meddling in worldly affairs. The Pope is the leader of a permanent observer at the UN. The Pope is a leader in the world. The Pope has these two roles, right, with the Vatican city-state. So the Pope has a right to engage as a diplomat, and the Vatican has a diplomat. So that's just reality. We can look at John Paul's efforts if we talk about the papacy and foreign affairs and his role in solidarity in Poland and the fall of communism and all of that. So I think that's a historical reality. In a way, in the modern age, that's very different from the pre-modern age, where that mixture was a little bit tougher. Is Cuba a godless nation? What does the Pope tell us? Let me read you something else. The Pope says, Francis says, I have a dogmatic certainty. God is in every person's life. God is in everyone's life. Even if the life of a person has been a disaster, even if it's destroyed by vices, drugs, or something else, God is in this person's life. You must try to seek God in every human life. No, Cuba's not a nation of godless people. What you want to say about the government is something different. But we have to always distinguish governments from the individuals who make up the nation. That's true for every nation.
Did you want to go to another email?
Those are the emails I have right now, but I actually, I wanted to ask you something, because I read conflicting things. In an article it says that the Pope doesn't have a cell phone, and maybe old news, didn't have a cell phone and doesn't have a computer. On the other hand, I can't believe these words are coming out of my mouth, I follow him on Twitter. You know, and he's had some very interesting tweets in the last month, and I thought I'd share them with you because I was wondering how he gets to the point of tweeting to begin with.
Well, Pope Benedict.
He did
Pope
tweet.
Benedict started that. So we have to be clear about that.
Does the Pope actually do the tweeting himself? Do you know?
You know, I don't.
I read that he phones, he calls people, but he doesn't do the tweeting.
Really?
That his staff does that, but I'm sure he must
approve.
yes.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
I don't know. You know, I think he sends out certain things, or they get excerpted, and he, you know, was asked for approval. That's.
I want to share these two tweets with you. One of them is basically marital advice. Husbands and wives need to communicate to bring happiness and serenity to family life. The other one I have a question about. The Lord put it clearly. You cannot serve two masters. You have to choose between God and money. That's, you know, we were talking before, that's a little difficult for, I would think, some politicos who are religious to reconcile. Don't you think?
The two tweets?
No, no, that tweet about you have to choose between God and money.
What he says in various places and in his The Joy of the Gospel, that exhortation, is that we can be held captive to the pursuit of money. Again, this is really not new. We make our idols of things in the world, and those idols change from historical era to historical era, I suppose. But certainly the trap in a modern or postmodern and a capitalist world is that trap of chasing money, that our success and our identity is in that. And he says our identity is in each other, and in each other we find God. So our identity is not in the money. And he's not saying, as St. Francis Assisi did, give up all of your worldly possessions
right.
and stand naked before the Pope and then go start a religious order. He's not saying that. But he's saying we have to redirect our attention.
And do you think that is resonating with Catholics?
What resonates is when yes, I think a lot of people it resonates with, and anybody who understands the Catholic social teaching tradition, the past 100+ years of that very explicit teaching, it's very clear. And of course, there's controversy of interpretation within the Catholic theological fold itself. But again, that's not just him. That's Benedict. That's John Paul, Paul VI. It goes back because the problem is the inequality in the world that exists because of that. We had a movement a few years ago, right? Occupy Wall Street and the 1%. Well, what does that tell us? All right, and any questions about the Arab Spring or why is there militant anything in the world? People need jobs. People need safety. They need a place to be safe, to live, to learn, to grow, and the incredible income gap doesn't allow for this, and so it creates violence.
One could argue differently if we wanted to have, and not that I'm qualified, a scholarly argument, that it is religion that is creating some of those problems. I mean, some of like the jihad, I mean, that is a religious battle, isn't it?
That's a question of definition. I mean, people are saying that, yes, we are doing this in the name of, but what are the social causes of that, right? And we have to look at that. And I'm not a sociologist, but there are economic, social causes. And when people are disenfranchised, there are problems. And so this gospel of wealth is what the tradition of Catholic social teaching has always countered.
I think I'd like to just extend our conversation because we've passed our usual time, but he's coming to the United States, isn't he, in this fall?
Yeah, in Philadelphia. Yeah.
And do you anticipate that he's going to be, I'll say the word hammering, on these topics?
Oh, wow.
He's probably going to make an address to the UN.
Right.
And he's been invited to visit the White House. But I've read that people who are familiar with his messaging think that he is going to zero in on just that.
Yeah.
The wealth and the inequality. And
right. Take a look at he just named 15 new cardinals for the second year in a row. So he's had the chance twice now to name new cardinals. There is not a single cardinal named from the United States. All right. These people have come from Myanmar, Thailand, Uruguay, Spain, which is European, but also what he has done is he's named people from, places that are not traditionally considered places of power within the church. So he's enfranchising the areas of the world where there's growth in Catholicism, where there are people who need to have a voice. So Dr. Christopher Bolito at Kean University, he's a papal historian, he said this: the Pope's choices for cardinal say that every local church deserves a place at the big table. And the growth in the church is coming more from the Southern Hemisphere, and so he wants to bring all these voices in. He wants to have dialogue. This was what he had said early in his pontificate. The only way to solve problems in nations, among nations, within societies, within the church, and he said it this way, is dialogue, 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 right? And so he is going to be talking about where the people are hurting. I don't think I said this earlier, but my absolute favorite image is when he says, the church should be a field hospital. After a war, when people are lying on the ground, you don't take a very sterile medical history and ask about whether you have high cholesterol. You put a tourniquet on the wound. And he says we have to meet the people where we are. And we bring, and this word we didn't use enough tonight, we talked about the apostolic exhortation, but it's the joy of the gospel. He smiles because he's joyous, because he knows that God loves him and everyone else, and that God is to be found there in those relationships. But he wants that joy has to begin with tending to the wounded, whether that's the socially disenfranchised in a first world nation, people here in Mamaroneck, Larchmont, or whether it's the poor in a Central American country, or people dying in terrible conflicts across the world. So he condemns every act of violence. He condemned the Paris attacks. And he's going to talk about that. We're a field hospital. We need to bring that healing love to the world. And that's what's attractive. And Benedict also said we have to be more attractive. But Francis is making that real in a very new way.
Well, we started by asking about the smiling Pope, and
right.
Thank you for bringing up the smile again. And also thank you for spending this time with us and the folks at home who called or who emailed in,
right.
And those who replied on the videotape. So
thank
Dr. Elena Procario Foley, thank you so much again for spending this time with us. If you'd like to come back, we can talk more about Pope Francis and the Catholic Church and his greater message for the world, as well as for the Church.
All right, thank you so much.
And stay tuned, right?
That's right. We'll be back with more community stories in a moment.